Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of this incredible webinar series. Before we get things kicked off and as people trickle in, we're going to begin with the video that sets up the week-long conversation.
Cities across Canada are looking for smart solutions to our housing affordability crisis. Hiding in plain sight is a generational opportunity to add missing middle housing to our residential neighborhoods as an alternative to condo buildings, or relying on environmentally harmful urban sprawl to provide large family homes. Potentially the fastest, least disruptive, and most cost-effective type of missing middle housing is at the smaller scale, adding 1 or more units to an existing single-family house and its yard. These types of homes are becoming more familiar in our neighborhoods. Garden suites, laneway homes, adding suites within the house, or dividing a house into multiple units. Our residential neighborhoods, made up mostly of single-family houses, occupy the majority of land in our city regions, offering great capacity to add new housing supply quickly to areas where we already have roads, transit, schools and health clinics, many other services and local businesses, and walkable communities. A recent study by the Urban Land Institute estimates that adding 1 unit to 15% of houses in Toronto would be equal to adding at least 100 condo towers. The question is, can this type of housing supply help with affordability and equity? Many municipalities are already rolling out these programs, including Toronto, but early evidence indicates that these programs are not generating affordable housing, but rather homes that are at market rate, great for more housing supply, but not necessarily for affordability. In some cities, where these programs have been in place for a few years now, the uptake by homeowners has been disappointingly low, even at market rate. House conversions and laneway houses are costly, and the process is onerous to navigate. So how can we design better programs and policies to deliver affordable units? For instance, can we reduce the costs of construction with, well, less construction? Instead of completely gutting houses and rebuilding them, can we develop pre-approved plans to add suites to the existing dwelling or replicable backyard homes and scale a renovation revolution? Can we create a municipal one-stop shop that provides everything the homeowner needs, from a local labor pool to innovative financial tools and a barrier-free process? Can the National Housing Strategy help roll out pilot projects in Canadian cities to encourage uptake and test new programs that benefit homeowners while yielding affordable units? Can we ensure that these programs are equitable and truly inclusive? Join the School of Cities, City Building TMU, and ULI Toronto for a 4-part webinar series to explore these and other solutions to create an affordable renovation revolution. Learn more and sign up for the series at affordablemissingmiddle.ca.
Once again, good afternoon, everybody. And obviously, you are the folks who did sign up to register for today. So welcome to you all. My name is Richard Joy, Executive Director of ULI Toronto. Welcome to day 3 of this week-long series that has been organized and curated by the U of T School of Cities and City Building TMU, the Toronto Metropolitan University. ULI is proud to host this series on our platform to attract many of our members, as well as the constituencies of both of these academic institutions. Before we get into this, as always, we begin with a land acknowledgement. As Toronto region-based organizations, we acknowledge that the land we are meeting on virtually is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, and newcomers in this generation or generations past. ULI Toronto stands in solidarity with Indigenous communities, demanding action and accountability for the ongoing legacy of the residential school system. We also like to acknowledge and honor those who come here involuntarily, particularly descendants from those who were brought here through enslavement. To better understand the meaning behind this land acknowledgement, we recommend 4 programs that we have uploaded to YouTube. These links will be made available in the chat. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Cherise Berta, Executive Director of City Building at the Toronto Metropolitan University, TMU, who will be our webinar moderator for this afternoon. Cherise's bio and all the bios of our speakers today will be provided in the chat just to make for a more efficient hour. Before I hand it over to Cherise, I want to make a note to our audience that ULI is a nonpartisan organization and we do not advocate on public policy, pro or con. We frequently take a critical look at public policy and the landscape in the context of advancing our global mission, which we'll put into the link. So that is the context of today's series. We're encouraging people to bring questions through the Q&A box. We will do our best to answer those questions within this hour. But if we fail to do so, and we may, depending on how many questions come in, especially, there is going to be a final report of the week that will also look at those questions, answered or unanswered, in an attempt to get to more of them than we may have time to do today. So with that, Cherise, we'll ask you to take it over.
Thank you so much, Richard. And thanks to everyone for coming back and joining us again today for part 3 of our series. So I hope you saw the first 2 panels. They were so educational and really exciting. And one of the things I learned from yesterday's panel was that in California, accessory dwelling units or secondary suites currently make up 20% of their new housing supply, which is astounding. And it took only 5 years to get to that level. And Denise from California actually referred to it as the ADU revolution. So I think we're on the right track here for this series. However, in yesterday's panel, they also mentioned that financing is still a big challenge for homeowners to create a secondary suite. So today, we are moving forward with the Show Me the Money part of the series. And so I'm grateful to have such a fantastic panel to navigate the finance question. As always, the full bios of our panelists will be popped in the chat as I introduce each of them, starting with Kira Gerwing, Chief Real Estate Investment Officer with Sacha Investments, Grayson Johnson, Senior Specialist Innovation and Research, CMHC, Marcel Gros, who's the co-founder of Ownably, and Stuart Dutfield, Manager, Environment and Climate Division, City of Toronto. So great to see everybody again today. And next slide, please. So on Monday, we were introduced to the missing little, the opportunity to add units to the single family house itself or on its parcel of land. And Monday's panel of architects explained how, rather than totally demolishing and rebuilding a home, renovating a home and adding simple, well-designed units can bring down construction costs. Next slide. So these numbers really stood out from Michael Piper's presentation on Monday. He presented 4 options to add missing middle. And to the far right, you see that with the renovations to create a triplex instead of tearing down the house, it's actually possible to get closer to affordability. And Michael also mentioned the carbon benefits of not demolishing the home. So this approach results in the lowest per square foot of the 4 options presented, which translates into lower rent required to make a profit, which is a great thing. So next slide, please. So perhaps it's possible to make the numbers work for the homeowner with reduced construction costs, the simplified plans that are pre-approved and repeatable, and solving the barriers that we talked about yesterday. But even if all this is achievable, the question still remains, why would a homeowner still want to go through a disruptive renovation and not charge as much rent as they can. So we're going to discuss that question. And let's get started with our panel. And I want to kick things off with Grayson. Grayson, can you set things up and help us understand what's currently available right now to a homeowner in Canada in the form of grants or loans or anything like that to add a unit to their existing dwelling or a garage suite or a laneway suite?
Thank you so much, Cherise. I love this series and I'm so grateful to be a part of it. So thank you to U of T and ULI and TMU. This is a wonderful discussion. So in this area, the quick answer is not much. And what I've really come to respect as an observer of this space for a long time is how difficult this is from a policy perspective. It is a very difficult needle to thread because we have this conundrum where, as you've rightly pointed out, these are some of the lowest cost and most desirable units that are available to us in the housing ecosystem. And yet there is this real financial barrier to creating them. However, when we are using public funds, whether if that's at a municipal or provincial or federal level, when we spend public funds on housing, there are always terms and conditions involved to ensure affordability, accountability, social benefit. And that level of administration doesn't translate very well to smaller projects. And so what you do see are some programs at a municipal level that might be a grant or a tax rebate or a forgivable loan, like Toronto has with their affordable laneway suites program. And at the federal level, what really is the financial benefit is that when we calculate, this is going to be quite technical, but when we calculate our debt service ratios in Canada, you're actually allowed to use your rent, the rent that you're collecting from those extra units to essentially make you to change your debt ratio so that you can access a greater mortgage, which is a long way of saying that you're able to access mortgage loan insurance for projects that have ADUs in them. This is only for purchase, it's not for refinance. We don't do refinance loans anymore. So what I have observed over the years is that the main financial barrier is or benefit is actually in removing barriers. And so cities that are doing this are making sure that these types of projects fly through the approvals process. City of Windsor has done a really good job of trying to make that happen. So same with City of Kitchener. A lot of municipalities, I'm sure many are on this call, are learning from each other to figure out how can we make this easy for people. City of Edmonton has a how-to guide and a video. At the provincial level, the Ontario government for years now has actually required that cities permit you to have 2 ADUs on your property. BC has plans to do the same. So we have our 2 provinces with the greatest housing shortage that are essentially saying every single family lot in their provinces should be allowed to have a triplex on it in the form of a couple ADUs. So that's a way of making that happen. And in Ontario, you're not allowed to charge development fees on that. And so that's a financial benefit. And of course, federally, we have that way to access a lower down payment by accessing that mortgage loan insurance. So it is a tricky thing. And I really appreciated Marcel's thoughts on this of how difficult it is to involve public money in terms of a direct grant or rebate. And I should also mention there is a brand new multi-generational home renovation tax credit that's up to $7,500. But again, there are terms and conditions. It's got to be for a senior family member or an adult relative with a disability. And that's the lay of the land there.
Oh my goodness. I'm going to have to go back.
You're going to have to stop me because I love this topic and we could go on.
We're going to have a fireside chat just with you. So that is so interesting. So I take away, there's like lots of little bits and pieces with lots of conditions and strings attached. And those strings aren't necessarily bad, but it's like a whole process of getting there and solving all these other things. And then we can get to scale. And if we can get to scale, then we can get to the bigger money. Maybe. So I like how you did like the segue to Marcel. Let's hear it from you. How well do these various options pencil out for homeowners and citizen developers? Like, can these many things, either on their own or combined, can they yield a profit or a meaningful revenue? Do the costs facilitate charging market rent or above market rent, or is it possible to get affordable unit in there?
Yeah, no, great question. A little bit loaded, so let's try to break this down a bit. I think just to kind of set the tone of the question, and I do want to address the elephant in the room, and the elephant in the room is the unintended consequence of, this as of right zoning, what it could provide and what it could cause, and what I'm even seeing in the market, from private investors, and what's happening is, because of the house prices and the cost and difficulty of doing these types of renovations to create 3 units or 4 units, investors need to create a yield invariably. So what's happening is individuals are going in, buying these properties. The last one I saw was a semi, and the numbers were unbelievable. They're renting them out furnished, basement apartments starting at like $3,000. And, I walked through, I happened to, I know one of the individuals, that was doing this, and I'm part of a, this underground community of investors. And it was like, you walk through this, it's a semi-detached in like, Leslieville-esque area. And it was unbelievable, right? Like the basement starting at 3,000. So I think, that's something that we need to consider from a policy perspective. Like, how do we avoid, because that essentially pulls, market units out of, off the market. Like I couldn't even afford to live in the basement. Most of us here probably as well. So I think that's something to consider. As far as like penciling out, I ran some back of the napkin numbers, and, you could start, it starts to make sense around a 4-plex. If policy could allow, a 4 plus a laneway, or a garden, it can start to get really interesting. Where you place that unit is likely on a 4-plex going to be your basement. That's going to be your least, the unit that generates the least amount of income. But, we ran some numbers kind of like, I'm looking at my napkin here, like $1,350 for a 2-bedroom basement, which would be, based on CMHC's kind of rents, 80% of CMHC's average market rents, which are about like 50% of the market. So it starts to be pretty affordable. Now that said, in order to do that, what I had to do with my numbers is I had to, shoot the lights out on my 2-bedroom that's on the main floor and my ADU, and all those will likely have to be, furnished or a mixture of furnished and market, right? So I get my higher yields on those, those more desirable units, maybe with a walkout balcony or whatever. And then I'm able to kind of slot in this affordable unit. And I think there's something, I think the long and short is 2 things that I've learned from this. Just quick exercise. The first thing is there's hope, right? I think there's hope, and there's hope for this kind of citizen developer to go in there and do this, because that's another angle to look at it. And the second thing is, I think when the citizen developer goes in, they really have to underwrite this from an investor perspective, meaning that, it's a pretty big investment. I didn't talk about the amount of money, but it's a pretty large number to get in and do these renovations. You want to make sure that you can exit, and you're doing whatever you're doing that provides you an exit. And I think if you do those 2 things, there's definitely, hope for these types of units to create some sort of affordable unit. And maybe, there's, from a policy perspective, there's some benefit to those citizen investors doing so.
Super helpful and sobering. Thanks, Marcel. I have a pre-ready question for you, Kira, but I want to go off the script for a bit and respond a little bit to Marcel's points, because one of the things that I took away from the first 2 panels was, the first panel was, yeah, you can actually do these renovations that are really simple and cost effective. Like we saw the numbers that Michael ran, and they're pretty achievable, right? It looked like those market, or the rents would actually be below market rate. The second thing we learned from yesterday is that the ADU program in California appears to be embraced by the actual homeowner who lives in the home, and they add the ADU, and it either one or two, but a lot of just ones. And then, but the deal there is it's scaled. It's scaled, and like you guys are saying, you have all of the systems in place, right? It's like creating that homeowner one-stop shop, the ecosystem. You can get everything done, and it's easy and it's scalable. So is there a different outcome if we have, you know, a scale where homeowners are actually adding a unit or 2 units? Kira, I'm going to throw that to you, but I also want to ask the question that I had all written out for you. You can say no, and I'll give you the other one.
No, that's great. And thank you. It's so nice to be here. I'm actually hailing from the traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations today, commonly known as Vancouver, British Columbia, one of the least affordable cities in Canada. Lots of single family homes here. So the maps that were shown in the video up front are, it's definitely something that we're battling here. We're also looking at densification of single family lots here. We're actually going to 5 units. Marcel, there are some really interesting small home builders that are coming up with some really innovative designs to get 5 units on a standard 33-foot by 120-foot lot in our city, which might be worth looking at for folks who are interested. So where I come from, in answer to your question, Charisse, about, you know, the outcomes that we're looking for, and if we're talking about scale, you kind of have to do a little bit of math to think, if we converted, what is the effort to convert every single family lot in a city like Vancouver or Metro Toronto? What's the effort required to convert every single family lot from 1 unit to 4 or 5 units versus looking at every community owned parcel of land in an urban center and creating incentives to redevelop community-owned land for purpose-built rental housing. And I will just disclose that like my penchant is for the latter, because the kind of another elephant in the room, and I'm sure there are plenty others too that we'll uncover over the course of our conversation, but another elephant in the room is when you are a private landowner, you are incentivized by margin. When you're a community landowner, you're incentivized by mission. And when you have a mission-driven incentive versus a margin-driven incentive, my belief is that your public dollar invested is going to go further in a mission-driven development than it would in a margin-driven development. So I just put that out there for conversation, and then to say, you know, the effort required when you're a public institution that's either enabling development through land use policy or through, you know, slipstreaming pre-designed authorizations or permissions to develop through, you know, how much of that effort is in incentivizing, and then how much of that effort is in enforcing on the other end. So Grayson mentioned this in her opening remarks too, like how much of it is about, you know, then making sure that the requirements of the rules that were developed around the program are actually upheld. And is that, I do kind of sometimes wonder if that's how we want to spend our time, enforcing rules. Some ideas to get the conversation going.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that. I really want to start to talk about some of the types of financial goodies that could make it attractive for homeowners to enter the program like they're doing in California at that scale. But Stuart, I want to jump over to you because you can tell us about local improvement charges as how they work for energy retrofits. And I'm wondering, is there a way that this type of financial tool could be applied to both adding an affordable unit to the principal dwelling and with green retrofits? And would it be possible to keep the numbers at the price point that we saw in Michael's analysis that I showed earlier?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me, everyone. I think that's a really interesting question. So just to give people a little bit of background, so LICs or PACE, so PACE in the US is the typical term, so it's Property Assessed Clean Energy Finance. In Canada, in Ontario, and other regions across the country, local improvement charges, or LICs, are enabled by regulation at the provincial level. And essentially what it is, it allows, in Toronto's case, a municipality to finance projects on individual properties. In our case, we have the Home Energy Loan Program, and how that works is an applicant would apply to us. We would provide them funding to do energy and water improvements on their house. And what they would do, they would complete the work, they would provide all the receipts to us, and then what we do is essentially create a bylaw, and through the property tax collection system, they then pay that money back to us. What is unique about this is that the LIC is not tied to the individual, it's actually tied to the property. And so it's a model that has been used extensively in the US, particularly in California. It has been used in Canada quite a bit as well, just in different forms. In Toronto, Halifax is a version of this. And actually, I just came from a conference yesterday where this has expanded across the country. So I think currently the focus is on figuring out how to grow this at scale in different regions across the country. There's programs launching in British Columbia, there's programs coming in Alberta, a whole suite of programs in the East Coast, et cetera. So currently our program and others are focused on the question of energy efficiency and increasingly really on decarbonization. So how do you decarbonize hundreds of thousands of homes in Toronto? But I would say there is a lot of potential there to look at more interesting ways of doing this. What we are seeing too, again, kind of recalling some of the things from the conference yesterday, is the question of equity and affordability are like really front of mind for ourselves at the city, but also other jurisdictions across the country, whether they be big markets like Vancouver and Toronto, or small little cities, which are all grappling with affordability issues in their own right. So I'd say yes, there's certainly a potential there. We're exploring those. We're seeing really interesting models coming out of the US. Colleague just before this call actually sent me something that was their twist on it was sort of aging in place, and their twist was aging in place efficiently, which again is, I think, another component of this whole sort of affordable housing challenge, housing more generally.
Yeah, I think you touched on it, how it's like very holistic, because you can just look at the retrofits as one element of being low carbon. But as we know, the low carbon benefits of getting more supply, housing supply in an existing home, reduces all that embodied carbon from the big buildings and having to sprawl and being able to use our existing infrastructure and streets and transit. Like those things aren't factored like immediately, but you bring them all together, plus affordability and aging in place, and you've got like this kind of triple, like the missing middle could be a triple middle. It could be like housing supply, check, affordability, check, green, check. So I think it is an interesting, so thanks for taking us through that, because I think it's really interesting to hear that it's kind of opening up and thinking more broadly. So sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, it's really interesting. And I think to your point, Cherise, it really speaks to how density is also it helps us limit the amount of carbon we want to be putting out into the atmosphere, if done well, and if done in a very considered and thoughtful manner.
Yeah, I think there could be a super cool program where we add that to the mix. Grayson, I want to go back over to you, because I remember in my long conversation with you a couple of months ago, and you started sending me all of these articles and stuff like that. And I remember reading, I think it was Greece, where one of the jurisdictions that use tax credits for homeowners to keep at least one of their units under market rate. And I know in that context, it was demolishing and building a new apartment building. But in the case of the missing little, where we want to add units and say we can add 1 or 2 units, or maybe even more in Marcel's case, what kind of, you mentioned that it's hard to create big financial tools for something that's this small, but what do you think could be created that's alternative to traditional home equity loans? Like could there be a situation where you have a tax credit for homeowners to keep at least one of their units under market rate? And so then the homeowner would generate the revenue from renting their properties plus get a tax credit. And then there'd be some sort of price point that would be associated with it. And then you'd have to work out a whole bunch of other things. But do you think that this could work in Canada? And how could it work? Or do you think there's a totally better option?
In terms of the feasibility and the political desirability of that, I just want to say that that is for our elected officials. So this is not something that I would really have an opinion on. That's something that we have to talk to our elected officials about, if that's something that we would desire. What I do want to point out is how important how influential the market conditions are on whether or not certain policies would work. And one thing I wanted to pull out of the conversation between Marcel and Kira there is Kira was saying, in BC and Vancouver, we're going 5 units. And Marcel was talking about the financial feasibility of, how many units do we need? A lot of that in this conversation is about, is it going to be for rent or is it going to be for sale? And something that is enabling a lot of this missing middle to happen in BC is they have different strata rules. And for those that are not from BC, stratification is what we call condoization in Ontario. I'm sure that there are many legal differences. So I apologize if someone knows the actual detailed differences. But essentially in BC, it is possible and it is common for people to stratify or to sell off pieces of a smaller house. Whereas in Ontario, that's not something that you see very often. And this is a question I really have, and I'm exploring in my own conversations and research. Because if you are able to, for example, convert into a 4-plex or a 5-plex or a 6-plex and sell off parts of those units, that completely changes the financing. It means that you are able to, access a mortgage, and the way that people view a mortgage psychologically is different than how they view rents. And so a lot of these policy tools that we talk about are really subject to what are the market conditions that we're in, because it is not, even in the US, I used to do most of my work with US clients before I joined CMHC. In the US, rents work. Rentals work in a lot of markets and a lot of cities there. And so you can make a living by creating rentals in small buildings. And so that's something that I wanted to pull out is, even if we have a tool that could technically work, it really is going to be likely temporary based on the conditions that we're in. And so I don't know that there is this one rule, one ring to rule them all when it comes to the housing policy or the mortgage policy here. And that is going to take an act of parliament. It's something that happens in the Housing Act. So it's not something that we would be able to just procure out of our ideas. I also wanted to note that the National Housing Strategy is actually doing a ton of work in this area that is not necessarily daylighted to people. So people don't see how much is happening, where the first couple of discussions that you had about architecture, pre-approved plans, removing barriers, there's a ton of work that I'm really lucky to be on the front row seat of that's happening through the innovation programs that are funded through the National Housing Strategy. So things like there's a gentle density accelerator that is being funded through Housing Supply Challenge in partnership with Impact Canada. That's in BC, and they're helping cities figure out their code to enable this. They're specifically looking and saying, how can we make this happen? And then they're creating a community of practice so that other mid-sized cities have access to that kind of knowledge. And they're trying to understand, what are the economics of doing this 1-to-6 conversion on a single family lot? How can we make that happen? That's one example. Another is adusearch.ca, which just launched. So look it up, adusearch.ca. That's helping. They've across 30 cities across the country. You can look up a lot, and it helps a homeowner figure out red light, green light, basically, if their lot is likely to support an ADU or not, and it helps remove a lot of the knowledge barrier there. And in doing so, they've also helped cities understand how they can streamline their code. Again, I can go on a lot. I know I'm over my time, so I'm just going to pass it back to you, because otherwise I'll keep going.
No, it's super rich information, and there are so many great resources out there. And Like Richard mentioned, there's going to be a report at the end of this whole series, and we will hopefully include a lot of those things that you're mentioning, Grayson, because they're so important. One of the things that you brought up was the national housing strategy, and I just kind of want to blue sky on that. You know, at one point a few months ago, I was doing some of my own envelope number crunching and came up with the typical below market rent unit from a new construction building. And it's not rent geared to income. It's just below like 80% market rent. And it looked like, with all the numbers that I had, and someone can show me better numbers, it looked like it was somewhere between 600 and 700,000 to actually build that unit. And that's partnering with a developer and, you know, giving all the density, giving all the market rate to the developer, and then you get a couple below market rent units out of it. You know, I've talked to some people who are like, you know what, we could actually, I need to look more closely at Michael's numbers, but I think that we could add an affordable unit, you know, order of magnitudes lower than that quantum, right? By adding a unit to an existing house with a renovation. And those types of things could be scaled, and assume they're like 50,000 or 100,000 to build. Would that not be a type of program to invest money in for a number of reasons? It's faster to deploy. It's low carbon. It can happen all throughout our neighborhoods and ensure some equity. I mean, is it crazy thinking that a program like this could be supported by the National Housing Strategy in a way that they invest in it in sort of financing ways, but also to support rolling out some of those pilots that generate an affordable unit? Who wants to jump all over that?
I can pop in and say that if people have ideas, they should submit them to the Innovation Fund. And because that is for piloting innovative ways of making this finance happen, and also ensuring affordability. So if you have ideas that you wanted to model in that way, that would be the avenue to do it, where we can learn and experiment, and if it works, then scale it.
Others,
maybe I'll just weigh in as well and just say there's sort of some kind of fundamentals, right? So if you have to pay market rate for land, and then you have to pay market rate for construction, and then you can't actually develop a below market product, right? The way that the foundations of the math work. So any incentive program has to be addressing some of those fundamentals around the cost of land, the cost of construction, and the cost of operating, right? So this low carbon solution, yes, you can reduce operating costs, but is it going to be enough to actually tip the scale that those savings are borne by the ultimate tenant? That's an interesting question, but my guess is that it's not going to tip the scale that much in terms of affordability. So then you have to start to think about, okay, if there is going to be a private landowner who is interested in, let's use the term, vending their land in to participate in a collective affordable housing solution like this, what is the quid pro quo, and what is a reasonable contribution from a public taxpayer administrate? Like it's our tax dollars that are going into it. So what is a reasonable trade-off to ask from a private citizen for a public investment into their property? I guess that's really what we're talking about here. And then I'll just reiterate my former point, which is that yes, we can get to scale. I'm not sure that it's easier to work with however many millions of single family homeowners it is before we tackle some of the higher density opportunities on community owned land. Think of every church, every school board owned property, every nonprofit owned property. But I just, for me, I know I'm being a little bit of a provocateur and a different kind of bent on this, but my gut tells me that if we've got a limited amount of funding that's available from the government, trying to distribute that to many for low density solutions, like 1 to 5 on a single family lot, versus, developing opportunities that are housing hundreds of people, hundreds of households at one time. I'm leaning towards the latter.
Okay, well, we'll talk to the folks in California who got 20% of their new housing supply from homeowners. And I think it's just really interesting if there's the types of financial incentives that they've been doing to get their homeowners, through tax credits to, deliver one of those units. And then suddenly it's all over the state, which is really, really fantastic. But I'm going to change course and go back to you, Stuart. If this type of affordable missing middle program is scaled, are there things like, because I'm interested in things like a revolving fund that shares the risk and revenue with homeowners and reinvests in more projects. Like, I know that revolving funds are often associated with green building investment. Could something like this work in this case? Oh, I think you're on mute.
Such an amateur mistake, 3 years into a pandemic. Sorry, double muting myself. But I was going to say, something just to follow on what Kira said. I think too, there's this aspect of sort of friction too, and getting more bang for your buck. And so there's an administration friction that has to come out, and then it's sort of identifying those opportunities where community land is available, because I think that's actually one of the areas we're looking now to, is like with these community housing providers, where's the opportunity there? Just because in some cases you have community housing providers who have larger tracts of land, and there may be some interesting things you can do there. But coming back to your question, I think, yes. So I think the nature of LICs is that it's very secure from the municipality's perspective, at least in our case, in the sense that, it's on the tax roll, that it's tied to the property. So, and in our experience to date, we've had really no issues with repayment. We're not talking about tens of thousands of properties, but it's been very secure, and we've had eligibility criteria that are also, I think, kept it secure. But that money, once it's beginning to flow back in, yes, in theory, you could start loaning it back out, and it's sort of figuring out what's that sweet spot where, if you had 20 million, you had 100 million, at what point do you have, 5 years into repayment, we start cycling that money back out. So I think that's certainly something that could be done. And again, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities is launching through the Community Efficiency Fund a whole suite of these programs across the country. Again, right now, very much focused on energy efficiency and decarbonization. But I think the 2.0 version of that will be really interesting to see. And again, I think it's, how much it's going to require a lot of money. So if we can make that money secure, if we can make the government as an investor in this feel secure, I think there could be certainly some opportunities for making this money to revolve and become like a Swiss Army knife, do lots of things all at once: decarbonization, density, aging in place, affordability, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a lot of interesting experiments happening right now. And like I said, the 2.0 version is going to be really interesting.
I love that. I love the Army knife version of that. Marcel, so earlier you walked us through how the current options pencil out. And I'm just wondering what you think. Let's go back to this issue of uptake. I keep looking back at California and how they were able to scale to 20% of their new housing supply coming from ADUs. What do you think? And they did it in 5 years. So what do you think it would take? And I want to sort of put aside the things that we talked about in the first two webinars, because the first webinar we talked about bringing down construction costs. So let's assume we've got those repeatable designs and the costs are down. And the second webinar, we talked all about the barriers, the building code, the bylaws, any of the things that stand in the way and say no. So assuming we've got those solved, like, how do we get to the next level? What's the next thing? This is what we're trying to do here in this panels. We're trying to figure out, how do we incentivize this in some way, and focusing on those homeowners who have those properties. They want to age in place. They want to unlock. A HELOC's like 7% right now. Like, what are the ways that we can incentivize these owners in these houses throughout our landscape? It's an untapped housing supply. What's the next thing?
Yeah, no, great question. Once again, a bit loaded, but let's see if we can take a stab at this. My whole thing is, and I'll give credit to what Grace Ann's up to. I think she nailed it, and I'm going to go down that rabbit hole, is innovation, right? And testing and piloting. I learned this fourplex and multi-unit stuff the hard way, right? And that was the old way. And I found a mentor, right? And in exchange for the mentor to teach me, I helped them do things. Like, I was good at designing logos and graphics and that kind of stuff. And I did their marketing for them. And they taught me how to buy and turn things into multi-units. So I think when I think about that, and I think about scaling, not everyone's gonna go off the deep end like I did and go all in and try to figure this out. So I think there's a huge educational kind of mentor-esque component that needs to happen with the average day citizen. And just to go back to what Kira said, community development versus this individual kind of do this on your own, citizen developer, or whatever you want to call it. There's a big part of this that really changed the trajectory of my life, being able to own something in a way where I lived in the basement initially while I renovated the upper units slowly, and then I got to move into the one on the main floor and rented out the basement. So that whole process, sure, it was hard and it was a learning curve, but it literally changed the trajectory of what I could do now that I achieved ownership. And I think that's something special for the individual and the family. And I think you can do both. I don't think it has to be an either or. The individuals that are developing community projects, they're pretty sophisticated. They know what they're doing. Really what I like and where I get excited is about empowering the individual to, kind of carve their place. Ownership's not for everyone. There's some regulatory challenges around, condominiumizing and strata title. If we can get through that, that'll make it a lot easier, like Grace Ann said. But in the interim, there's a opportunity for maybe people to come together and do a fourplex, be creative with things. There's some really cool concepts that, known as rent to own or lease to own, that can be implemented. So I think it's taking a look at this from an innovative way, and really how do we, when I say we, the universities and individuals like me and whoever it is, educate the individual owner to be able to make a quick decision, so that when you see that property, exactly the risks that are involved, and you can make an informed decision, right? Okay, yeah, I can do that one, can't do that one over there, but over there, maybe in Scarborough, it's possible, right? So I think these are for me, that's the starting point. It's really educating and this kind of mentor in your pocket, maybe. From an innovative standpoint, you kind of see where I'm going with this, but that's really where I see the starting point.
Yeah, I know that Grayson mentioned ADU search, which kind of does that. Hey,
exactly. Yeah. That's the start, right? Yeah.
And can I riff on that for just 1 second? Because I'm noticing now that the whole premise of this conversation is that there needs to be some kind of financial incentive. And I will say that from my experience, I have witnessed on the ground, and I continue to witness on the ground, that a lot of people that are doing this because they care about their communities, or they care about a person, or they care about a building. And I don't think that we have nearly tapped that market. Like Marcel is saying, to educate and enable and grow capacity in people that really just care about the place that they live. And they see this as really important for there to be grocery store clerks that live in their neighborhood. I don't think we've even scratched the surface of that. This stuff is barely legal barely legal in most places. So, and most banks don't know how to lend on it, right? Credit unions are leading the way, but we've really barely scratched the surface of people that want to do this and are willing to make it happen at a financial loss because they care about, they have other goals, right? They are housing someone that they love, or yeah, it's, they're learning, they're like Marcel was talking about, they're like improving themselves. And so I think that there's a huge opportunity there before we get into what money can we give people to do this.
Yeah,
Or even-
I just want to echo that. I love that. So Marcel, thanks for telling that personal story, because I think that's a very different motivation, and it feels like a better motivation to me. And we talk about like financial incentives, but are there other more creative ways of incentivizing folks to leverage the assets that they have for community outcomes? That's a very interesting line of inquiry. And then the other thing that I'll just throw into the mix is instead of incentivizing, sometimes we've seen some, this is, I feel like I'm like the provocateur today, but we've seen some disincentives. Like, so when you tax what you don't want, right? So what does it look like if you tax a single family homeowner who is not applying to at least legalize a secondary unit in their home? What would that look like?
I love that idea. I think
I had this one quick thing. This one other really kind of idea that came to mind. Like, what about, like, on that note, Kiera, to help avoid some of the unintended consequence, what about making it, really, and there's a question in here that in the chat, what about making it really like a huge incentive for individuals that maybe own or occupied these units to maybe there's a capital gains incentive. So it's not today, but maybe it's in the long term. So there's no capital gains maybe on the rental component of your property.
Yeah, or a property tax
right?
deferral might be another one, right? Like, you're adding value to your home by adding an ADU. What would it look like if you weren't taxed on that for 10 years?
Exactly. So the types of tax incentives, or any of the type, maybe you don't want to call them incentives, but maybe they're ways to encourage the homeowner who lives there, who wants to age in place, who doesn't want to have to take out a HELOC, right? So those are the benefits of the aging in place, of providing options for other people as well, right? So that's all good community stuff, and for the homeowner. But they might not, and this gets back to your point about education, Grayson, they might not know about this, right? Like, they think their only options are to take a HELOC or to sell their home and go live out of their community. So having those types of incentives or for financial supports to help people, because we often hear, oh, they need to leave their big homes so we can make those available for other people. Well, wouldn't it be great if there's a way for them to stay and create units for others? Are there any final thoughts on that, like things to get us to the next level so that more homeowners can do that?
Maybe just really quickly, and I think it's a riff on what everyone else has said, but access to information, or the ability to access information and programs, is a privilege, right? And so there needs to be some degree of navigation out there. And we're seeing this again in the sort of green spaces, concierges, that you need people to help you navigate that. Because even someone like myself who's in this space, I find these things difficult to navigate, as I'm sure all of the experts on this panel do as well. So, what is the concerted effort that happens around reducing the friction, making the navigation of this easier? So again, I love the point that everyone made. We're seeing a lot of people that are taking on these deeper retrofits, not because it's ultimately going to be cheaper, but they believe in the carbon equation. And I can guarantee you they also agree in the sort of community aspect, the housing piece of this. But we need to find ways on math to make it easier to navigate the process.
That's the HGTV show that we need, right? How to build an ADU.
Yeah,
good idea. Love it.
Probably
Yeah.
exists. There's Richard. I'm going to ask Richard if he has any last minute Q&As from the audience.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions here. As mentioned at the beginning, we'll have taken the opportunity in the final written report to address many of them that don't get addressed now, which will probably be very few. I will say that the top question is probably something we need a tax lawyer for, not probably on the panel, but it is would having an income would have income generated through renting part of your personal home affect capital gains exemption when the property is sold? I don't know if any of you know the answer to that. You do? Okay, Marcel, jump on.
Okay, so I'm gonna talk about this, like, full disclosure, I'm not a tax accountant, and you should speak to your tax accountant, but I'm going to speak just from my personal experience. So you are, and this was one of the points in my kind of crazy idea I was coming up with, right? So absolutely. So when you live in a multi-unit, you have to determine with your accountant what portion of the property is owner occupied, right? So if your unit that you're living in is 25% of the entire building, then that portion of capital gains will be the idea is that portion will go untaxed, because in fairness, you're bringing in revenue from the remaining 75%, so that has to be taxed accordingly. So this is definitely speak to your accountant about how to do this. The other thing you want to do is, if you do choose at some point to move out, one smart thing to do is to capture the value at that point. So, let's say you bought the thing at whatever, $1 million, and you did your thing, and now it's worth 2.5, and you move out at that 2.5, get an appraisal then, just so, if you decide to keep it, it may be at 3 million, in a few more years, right? So you've captured your component of when you live there.
Okay. Another question, the top question was answered, I think, in part by a number of you, including Stuart's last comments about where do you go to find out how to navigate all this. And I think the short answer is right now that is still something that needs to be improved. If I could answer that question directly, I think that's probably where everybody would agree. There was a question. I'm going to skip over one, which is more of a comment, but lots of comments aimed at you, Grayson, and CMHC that you've probably seen. And again, we'll look at those in the final report. Rent control on auxiliary units. Is that something that is a factor? Maybe who wants to take that one? I don't know if that's a city question or who.
Well, I'll just point out that, income qualifying is a major undertaking and has a really sophisticated kind of ethical knife blade that you have to navigate. And so, trying to link that with a single family homeowner, I think opens a huge can of worms that frankly I hadn't even thought of until you raised that question, Richard. But it's like, part of the reason why below market rental housing is so well done by the nonprofit sector is because they have absolutely professionalized dignity and respect in the way that they are actually tying the eligible residents to the much needed stable, adequate homes that they're building. So it's a great question. I think it needs to be thought through.
That's a super way to end this, because I know, Richard, you have to close this out, right?
Yes, I do. Thank you. And I apologize to our audience for having to do that, because again, this was a session that flew by very quickly. So Cerise, thank you very much for your moderation. Kira, Grayson, Marcel, Stuart, amazing panel. And it's just, I think, just really given us, increased our appetite to explore this more deeply and more urgently. There's just so much here, as we've discovered. So if I could just get my colleagues, or I guess you have put up the slides here. We have one final session, a really important one tomorrow, where we look at the lens of equity, which is actually something that is a great comment that Kira ended us on, because that is going to get explored in much more detail tomorrow. So please tune into our final session. And then a very special treat in the next slide. There is a book event that is in person, so we could maybe meet some of you actually in person, and perhaps some of our panelists who are in Toronto might even attend this as well for more conversation. But the remaking of the American dream, the informal and formal transformation of single-family housing cities, and you can see the author will be there. That's tomorrow at the World Urban Pavilion in Regent Park at 6:30. The registration link has been put into the chat. So we hope that you will, if you can, attend this and meet a bunch of us when you do that. And with that, we'll tie things off with great thanks on time to everybody and to our audience. We'll see you tomorrow.